When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be continuing our Preston Jacob's React series about how the Maesters tried to kill the dragons, the Maesters, how they were all pivotal in that. So again, I want to point out before we get into this video, also, I'm glad you guys liked the first part of that. You guys definitely wanted to see a second part. So thank you guys all for that. So again, I wanted to say before we get into this, again, if you guys haven't watched the original video, or you haven't subscribed to Preston Jacobs, or you don't know about Preston Jacobs, go over there and check him out. Fantastic YouTuber, and really helps the community a lot. I think he really helped get the A Song of Ice and Fire community going, and also being consistent and building the YouTube community. And for me, just wanted to give him a massive shout out before we get into this video, because he also did give me permission to react to his videos. So again, big shout out to him. Also, I wanted to say, hopefully visually and audio wise, this looks better than the last one. I tried to play around with it and make it, a little bit louder for you guys, and also so it wasn't like peeking out of the bottom of the border I have on the screen. So yeah, let's get into it. And also, I am going into this pretty much blind. I don't think I've ever watched this video before. So let's see what he's got in this video. All right, here we go.
Part one, we talked about how the Maesters, the Hightowers, and the Strongs influenced Targaryen succession and marriages. This led to Viserys the Pushover becoming king, Alicent Hightower becoming queen, and a whole lot of alienated people in House Targaryen and House Velaryon. Meanwhile, Archmaester Gildain is whitewashing history.
Yeah, just for a summary, since he's going to do a pretty fast summary. Basically, the major events of what we talked about in the last video are: how does Viserys become king, and the sketchiness between the Great Council, and also how we're getting told these events, right? It seems very biased. There seems to be sources that don't really make sense, and a lot of that is taking place. And then the second part of last week's video, and going into Preston Jacob's first part, was a lot of the marriages that are being proposed, like he talks about in the beginning of this video. And notably, we really look at a couple: Alicent to Viserys and Rhaenyra to Laenor. Those were really the big two ones, because the Maesters had their hands deeply involved in both of those marriages. Another thing I want to point out before we keep going further: this was made before Fire and Blood, so we do have to take that into consideration as well.
To make the Maesters look
Somebody
innocent,
reminded me of that
and
in
the
a comment
Targaryens
last
look
video.
like a bunch of crazy sex fiends. Now, before we get back to history, I'd like to go over a few more accusations made by Lady Dustin and Maester Marwyn. The Grey Rats read and write our letters, even for such lords as cannot read themselves. And who can say for certainty that they are not twisting the words for their own ends?
So this is a great point. We can directly compare this to Fire and Blood and House of the Dragon. When we see that Lord Baratheon, when Luke and Aemond are there. Now, Luke gives the letter, or the scroll, whatever, to Lord Baratheon. Lord Baratheon can't read. And that's something we talk about here right there with what he just brought up, is that some of the lords and the people in Westeros can't read, so the educated people, like the Maesters, have a lot of importance there, because their job is then to communicate what that message was accurately. But the Maesters can put a spin on what that message actually says into a different tone, right? We talk about in our real life world, right? Where texting, right? Texting can lead to some communication issues where maybe I meant something in like a friendly way, or more of a not strict way, or something like that, and somebody takes it a different way. That could happen a lot with Maesters. And we even see that, like, Lord Baratheon in that scenario in Fire and Blood, we're not sure why, but he gets super pissed off. You can maybe make some assumptions that Rhaenyra is kind of undervaluing the Baratheons, not offering them things to come to their side. Maybe it could be things like that, but it also could be something that the Maester whispers into Lord Baratheon's ear to have Lord Baratheon go with the Greens. And he's probably going to talk about that in this video, but that's some of the stuff that is crucial and what that quote is explaining.
Lady Dustin has a point. The Maester's control over communication gives them incredible power. They tend to us when we are sick and injured. Out of gratitude, we give them a place beneath our roof and make them privy to all our shames and secrets. A part of every council. And before too long, the ruler has become
That's
the
a great
ruled.
point.
Again, it's hard to argue with Lady Dustin. The Maesters are well placed to be spies, counselors, and even...
And we also see in other points of history, there's some conspiracies when people die. One of Jaehaerys' heirs, right? There's a conspiracy that the Maesters let him die. And we see that all around certain characters with the Targaryens in history, that could the Maesters have either poisoned one of these characters, or could they have even just let them die, or just do what basically Pycelle does, right? Pycelle he kind of steps back and lets Jon Arryn die, right? There probably wasn't much he could do, but again, he doesn't help it. He just lets it run its course.
The manipulators say nothing of prophecies or dragons unless you fancy poison in your porridge. Whoa there, the Maesters are murderers? Assassins? Well, the Maesters are armed with all sorts of undetectable poisons.
Yep.
And Maester Cresson did try to kill Melisandre, and Pycelle...
Again, another great point. And also, he's about to reference what I just talked about. But, again, a great point that we've seen all of these Maesters within the normal story have their own motivations. Now, Cresson's, maybe his was a little bit more noble, but he also is trying to take out magic. Could you make that connection?
Pycelle did let Jon Arryn die. In a world where women die in childbirth all of the time, and babies are stillborn all of the time, and people die of infection and disease all of the time, it would be impossible to determine if a Maester let someone die or murdered them. And as Cresson's mind tells us, an education in healing at the Citadel includes an education on killing. The simple fact that the Maesters are equipped with poisons that make murders look like accidents...
And that's the biggest thing. It's like, if you are researching something, you have to also know how to use that thing, right? If we look at even Lord of the Rings, I've been doing Lord of the Rings videos on my second channel. Saruman is someone that starts by trying to learn about the Rings of Power and all of these things that Sauron is famous for, and then he gets corrupted by them and starts to learn how to use them. So, kind of same thing, basically.
Is pretty damning by itself. The Maester's complete control over medical care makes one wonder about certain events in history. For example, Viserys' first wife, Aemma Arryn, repeatedly suffered from miscarriages. She had 2 sons die in the cradle, and she herself died in childbirth. Without those sons dying, or Aemma dying, or Alicent Hightower being the right age, the Dance of the Dragons may not have happened at all. Maybe those deaths
those could be accidents, but we don't know.
Weren't. We'll simply never know.
Exactly.
But Maester treatment can be awfully fishy sometimes. For example, in the year 126, Viserys cuts himself on the Iron Throne, gets an infection, and loses a couple fingers. He never again sits the Iron Throne, and Otto Hightower effectively runs the country. Viserys is sick and bedridden for 3 years after this cut, and Gildane's writings about the period are incredibly odd. You see, the rogue...
Again, these are Maesters that are trained professionals. And a cut is what led to Viserys being eventually bedridden for years? It seems like a situation where the Maesters didn't really help it. Like, they just wanted it to get infected, and that's more or less what happened.
Viserys' death, and the Princess and the Queen begins with it. However, the Rogue Prince ends with Grand Maester Gerardis taking care of Viserys. But the Princess and the Queen begins with Grand Maester Orwyle taking care of Viserys. So there was a switch in Maesters that Gildane decided to not tell us about. This is a little odd, as Gildane tells us that Gerardis was very effective. Though I wonder how effective. Viserys was practically bedridden for 3 years.
From a cut.
So what happened to Grand Maester Gerardis? Well, Varys reveals his fate in A Storm of Swords. Aegon, the son of Viserys and Alicent Hightower, fed him to a dragon. How on earth did Gildane fail to mention this in his histories?
Yeah, again,
perhaps
very
Aegon
odd.
Was suspicious of his father's medical treatment as well. Whatever the case, Viserys dies in the year 129.
That's an interesting point, though. Was Aegon II upset about this? Could that be the reason, or was it just more Aegon's kind of a psychopath a bit more? Both could be true. Could be a Joffrey situation.
Hightower and the small council convene, and Grand Maester Orwyle says some strange things. A raven must needs be sent to Dragonstone at once to inform Princess Rhaenyra of her father's passing. Mayhaps Her Grace the Queen would care to write the message, so as to soften these sad tidings with some words of condolence. Yeah, Orwyle, that's...
What? Why? Why would Rhaenyra... Okay, so this is the thing, right? In House of the Dragon, they play this up as Alicent and Rhaenyra have this great relationship and then it kind of falls apart. In the book, it's like, yeah, they're friendly with each other, and then all of a sudden, no, they just straight up hate each other. They don't want anything to do with each other. They don't like each other. There's no real past relationship there, really. Why would... That doesn't make any sense.
Never gonna happen. Alicent and Rhaenyra hate each other.
Exactly.
Also, why should the widow be sending out condolences? Shouldn't she be receiving them?
Yep.
And of course, we must begin our preparations for Queen Rhaenyra's coronation. All right, Orwell, it seems at this point it's pretty obvious that some people don't think that Rhaenyra is going to be queen. Are you trying to piss the Greens off so they won't compromise? Or is Gildane just trying to make Orwell look neutral? After Otto Hightower and the small council...
I think it's a mix of both. So, one, I think you could look at this idea and go, well, if we write down in the histories that Orwell was straight up like, okay, so who's going to be, you know, king or queen, Aegon or Rhaenyra? If he said it like that, then it's like, okay, Orwell definitely was not, you know, following Viserys' commands. It wouldn't make the Maesters look as good in that scenario. But obviously, Orwell knew that the Greens wanted Aegon II to be on the throne, and you're in King's Landing, which is mainly the Greens at this point, besides Lord Beesbury. It's really odd, and it doesn't seem natural.
Council announced their plan to crown Aegon over Rhaenyra. Orwell says that the issue will certainly lead to war. Why must it lead to war? Why can't there be power sharing or co-rule or a few marriages to sort things out? There are probably hundreds of different compromises that could have been made between the Blacks and the Greens, with all of them being better than going to war with dragons.
I disagree with this point there. I think at this point, you look at the way the Greens and the Blacks have separated, the two sides hate each other. How would there have been a peace negotiated? Both sides, what they wanted was basically to be on the throne. And here's the issue. If you do a compromise, it'd have to be something like Aegon and Rhaenyra rule together, but they would never want to do that. And Rhaenyra, at this point, again, Rhaenyra is not the character she is in the show. From what we're told at this point, Rhaenyra is a character that has already, like, had Vaemond kidnapped and killed, like, in front of her. She is not this person that's going to be okay with ruling with Aegon. And I think on the other side of that is like, okay, well, let's say we divide the kingdom. Rhaenyra is going to be thinking, why should she divide her kingdom? It's the exact same thing of, say, the War of the Five Kings, right? Renly is not willing to, like, just give up the North. Like, Rob can call himself whatever he wants, but still part of the Seven Kingdoms. It's the same idea. I disagree with Preston on that point. I don't think there really was a compromise at this point. I think after Viserys' death, the Greens kind of had made up their minds, and I don't think Rhaenyra and Daemon were going to
keep in mind that after
do something
Viserys'
different.
death, Aegon didn't even think he was king. And Rhaenyra had no ill will towards Aegon. She believed he was manipulated by the small council.
Which she was, but again, we're not talking about Aegon, because Aegon gets forced into it. It's Alicent, Otto, all these characters like Kristen Cole, that are the ones that are going to push that.
Whatever the case, Orwell is sent to Dragonstone to treat with Rhaenyra. Gildane writes that the terms offered by the king were generous. If the princess would acknowledge him as king, Aegon would confirm her in possession of Dragonstone. Her boys by Prince Daemon would be given places of honor at court.
Again, I've talked about this in my own Maester conspiracy theory. These are not generous terms. Like, Rhaenyra is gaining nothing. She already owns Dragonstone. Her boys by Prince Daemon. Again, note how it's not her first three, right? Will be given places of honor at court. Why would Rhaenyra offer her sons up to be hostages? That's more or less what they would be. This gives her nothing. Like, an actual generous terms would be, Rhaenyra, we'll give you this compensation, but I'm going to stay king. That's the way this would have gone. There was nothing offered here.
Of course, these terms aren't generous at all. Rhaenyra already has
And also, the generous part is made to make the Maesters and the green side look good.
Dragonstone, and Aegon is asking for 2 hostages. But just as Tyrion says in A Clash of Kings, unacceptable terms are a beginning. Bargaining and negotiation involves a back and forth, and yet Orwell never returns to Dragonstone again. He screws up his trip so much that negotiations completely break down.
But like I've talked about, I mean, yes, negotiations you know, there has to be a first offer and then a counter offer. I just think in this situation, it was too far gone at this point. I don't think there was any compromise they could have came to. Let me know down in the comments if you think the opposite of that, but I would love to know your guys' thoughts on that.
That makes Cleos Frey an infinitely better diplomat than Maester Orwyle. But of course, a breakdown in negotiation may be exactly what Orwyle intended. Another breakdown in diplomacy happened
Here
at
we go.
Storm's End. Rhaenyra's son Luke arrives at the castle to win over the Baratheons. Unfortunately, he's been beaten there by Aegon's brother Aemond. Now these two have a history, and Aemond lost his eye in a fight with Luke. Now Luke is little out of luck, as Aemond has agreed to marry a Baratheon daughter, while Luke is already betrothed. Nonetheless, Luke delivers Rhaenyra's request for...
Yeah, and this is the misstep for Rhaenyra, is Rhaenyra kind of was pulling on the honorable strings, because the Baratheons had sworn to her as queen. Also, Rhaenys is also related to the Baratheons. So she kind of took them for granted here. She didn't really offer anything. While as if you look at what the Baratheons stand to gain with Aemon's offer, the Baratheons directly now marry into the throne. So again, I think Rhaenyra takes them a little bit for granted here, and that's why maybe Lord Baratheon gets upset, but he shouldn't have got upset as he did, and that's what I think is interesting.
Baratheon support. Now, Lord Boros Baratheon is illiterate, so the Maester has to communicate the contents of the letter to him.
Yeah, and this is
We're not
exactly
sure
what I talked about at the
Maester
beginning of the
said,
video.
but it causes Baratheon to frown and call Rhaenyra a bitch. He then gives Aemond leave to go attack Luke outside, despite the fact that Luke is an envoy. What probably happened is that the Maester twisted the words to make them sound harsh to anger Baratheon.
Exactly, and this is what I was talking about, right? Where we have this lapse of communication, where yes, the more or less the message is here. So, like he says here, she demands your forces. Could also mean, you know, I need your help or your forces to honor your oath type thing, right? And when you put it in these words, she demands your forces. That's much more of an authority thing. That's much more of a blatant kind of a disrespectful way of asking for help. And to me, I think that is probably what happened here, is that even if this Maester that we see, if he didn't have any malintent, he didn't communicate this message properly.
But let's assume that the message was actually a really rude commanding. Isn't it still the Maester's job to soften the blow? At
Yes,
best,
it
the
is.
Maester mismanaged an explosive situation. At worst, he did it intentionally.
Yep.
Luke and his dragon were killed outside of Storm's End, and the Dance of the Dragons began. Now, despite only having a few houses support her and being stuck on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra actually has the advantage in the war. She simply has many more dragons.
Yeah, so that's the big thing if we look at the blacks and the greens. The blacks, for one, have more dragons. They have better military leadership with Daemon, Corlys. They have a better fleet at this point with the Velaryons. They have things that definitely give them the advantage. Now, the other thing the greens have for their advantage is they have more money, so gold. They have Vhagar, so the biggest dragon. So again, depending on how you use that, it's a major advantage, which the greens do use to their advantage. They can play on some of the bad reputations of characters like Daemon and Corlys and the Triarchy who do not like them. And they also, again, it's very different in the way the book and the show does it, but they actually had like a decent amount of planning time after Viserys' death. So they kind of got out to the front foot in the Dance of the Dragons. They were able to crown Aegon first. They were able to maneuver, send letters to all these other lords before the blacks could. And that's kind of the advantages for both sides.
In fact, the Greens basically only have 4 that they can ride. So as we mentioned, Vhagar first kills Arax, and in a 3-way battle, Sunfire and Vhagar kill Meleys. A fleet from the Free Cities kill Varimax and Stormcloud, but it's not good enough.
And something I want to point out with all these is this was not like the Maesters doing. You know, the Maesters did kickstart this conflict, which I think at the very least, you'd have to say they've done some suspicious stuff, even if you haven't bought into this theory yet, that they've let this conflict happen. Now, with that being said, all of these dragons dying are the result of Rhaenyra not addressing the problem. She is someone that, after the loss of children, she gets into a worse and worse state. She isn't really the commander-in-chief of the Blacks. Whereas Alicent is this character who we see as kind of the figurehead of the Greens. Rhaenyra starts to shy away from that. Other characters are now starting to kind of take over and be in charge, like Jace, like lists like Damon. Rhaenyra is someone that is too cautious, and we can understand why she is that. She is someone that doesn't want to risk her children's lives in this war. She doesn't want to lose more children, and those things kind of result in people dying. Rhaenys and Jace specifically. And yeah, that's something I wanted to note, that those specific deaths were on more Rhaenyra than they were the Maesters.
Conquer King's Landing and take the dragons there. Sunfire is injured, and so the Greens are down to 2 dragons. The Blacks have essentially won. But then 2 letters, one at Tumbleton and one at Maidenpool, change everything. 2 of the Blacks' dragon riders, named Hugh the Hammer and Ulf the White, defect for some reason. Gildain oddly claims that we'll never know the truth about the incident because Hugh and Ulf were illiterate. But what does literacy have to do with the issue? Gildain also weirdly claims that Hightower men had infiltrated Hugh and Ulf's men, but that it wasn't important. It seems much more likely that
So again, I think the way we look at this is the Greens saw an opportunity here. Again, these 2 are the least loyal to Rhaenyra. They are in a position where Rhaenyra isn't really, like, offering them a lot, like not giving them a lot of rewards for being in the war and on their side. So I could see this as maybe the Maesters sent them, but I think this is more of just the Greens faction in general swayed them over. And I just don't think that they kind of put that down in history.
Has it backwards, that Hugh and Ulf were literate, and that the Hightower men were important. Could those Hightower men have passed a letter to Hugh and Ulf? Gildain then claims that Hugh and Ulf demanded the Iron Throne and Highgarden. But why Highgarden? Why demand the possession of your ally when you can demand the possession of your enemy? Why not Winterfell?
Exactly.
The reason for choosing Highgarden was supposedly because Ulf saw the Tyrells as traitors because they didn't participate in the war. But of course, this makes no sense at all, considering that Hugh and Ulf were traitors themselves.
Exactly.
It seems much more likely that a Hightower letter offered Highgarden and the Iron Throne to Hugh and Ulf. Whatever the case, these defections led to the Second Battle of Tumbleton, where 4 more dragons were killed. Hugh and Ulf were also betrayed by the Hightowers there. Now Daemon and the dragon rider Nettles are hanging out at Maidenpool. The Maester of Maidenpool shows them a letter, supposedly from Rhaenyra, ordering the death of Nettles because she heard a rumor that Nettles was banging Daemon. It seems remarkably odd to suddenly worry about infidelity in the middle of war, and angering Daemon and killing a dragon rider would be incredible.
This is what I disagree with this part as well. I think this is a stretch. So we know Rhaenyra up to this point is someone who's been completely unstable. Think about what has gone on so far. She, in her mind, at this point of the story, believes that she has 1 son left. She believes she only has Aegon left. She believes her first 3 children, or her first 3 and her youngest has died. So, with that being said, she now is feeling super alone. And Daemon has this reputation of kind of sleeping around and being disloyal. And then when you also factor in the ideas that she's already had 2 dragon seeds betray her, again, you can see why it would lead her to sending this kind of letter to basically have Nettles sent away or killed. Again, I think this makes perfect sense. I don't think this is a Maester conspiracy thing. I think that part's a bit of a stretch for me. But yeah, I see what he's going at is like, it's kind of a very mysterious thing.
It seems.
But again, Rhaenyra has proves all throughout the Dance of the Dragons, she doesn't make good decisions. And that's, I love Rhaenyra's character. I love doing a deep dive of her character, but she makes stupid decisions. This is one of them.
Quite likely that this letter was a forgery of some sort, perhaps by the Maidenpool Maester. This all results in Nettles flying off to Essos to be never seen again, and Daemon to go off and have a suicidal fight with Aemond. And so we can see a few well-placed letters really even the score between the Blacks and the Greens. And then there's a riot in King's Landing that kills off all but a few of the dragons. Although Gildain reports that the rioters were overcome by some sort of madness, it's rather clear that whoever stormed the dragon pits were well organized, well armed, and well motivated. But who could be the...
Now, this is a great point, right? The Maesters could have done some stirring up here, could have helped this happen.
Culprit.
But
the Maesters certainly don't have control over the small folk of King's Landing, and neither does House Hightower. Who could possibly motivate hundreds of people to run into a burning dragon pit? And what could possibly make these people think that they could become dragon slayers? As it turns out, there's one more group from Old Town that knows a lot about dragons. And that group is the faith of the Seven. And we'll talk about their role.
That is true. The faith, the Maesters, all of that could have been involved in that idea. And I think this is a good stopping point for part 2. And again, I think there was a lot that I agreed with in this video, but different from the first video and the first part where I agreed with pretty much everything Preston Jacob said. I think there was a couple things in this video where I didn't necessarily agree. Let me know what you guys think. Like, I personally don't see the Maesters sending that letter to Damon and Nettles, or, well, it wasn't sent to them actually, but, you know, I don't think that, I think that was Rhaenyra, personally. But let me know what you guys all think about this, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. We'll be doing part 3. It's a little bit shorter, but thank you guys all for watching. Let me know what your guys' thoughts are.